Professor Kundan Singh is from US. He's on a trip to India, and utilizing that opportunity, we have invited him for a lecture. As you know, Professor Kundan Singh is basically from Delhi, then moved to US. Presently, he's a professor in the Sofia University, Palo Alto, and he's the president of the Cultural Integration Fellowship, San Francisco, and he's a senior fellow at Hindupedia also. He has written many books. He's a well-known author, orator, and he has done deep research in Aurobindo philosophy also. And today, we are very proud that he is with us in our Mythic Society. I request him to deliver the lecture, and I welcome him on behalf of the Mythic Society Managing Committee as well as the audience.
Thank you very much, Prasannaji, Mythic Society, and Indic Academy for giving me the opportunity to speak on a topic which is very dear to my heart. It is dear to my heart because it is looking at the regeneration of India. It is looking at the intellectual colonization of India. I am of the view that our political colonization may have ended, but the intellectual colonization has not ended. It is basically because of the trail of work that the British colonials have left behind. Beginning with 1784, when the Asiatic Society in Kolkata was established. If we go into the writings of William Jones, Asiatic Society had a very clear agenda of what it wanted to do. It wanted to understand India, and it was very clear about India's accomplishments in the past. It wanted to understand, believe it or not, India's sciences, geography, laws, and many other things, about which they undertook the exercise very, very systematically. Of course, they were taking the help of the local people, the local scholars, the local pundits, if you will, in the translations. But all the translations that were happening in Asiatic Society was happening under the explicit agenda which had been laid down by William Jones. These translations traveled to Europe, and the European people started dealing with these translations, I should say, in their own creative and inventive ways. One of the individuals was by the name of James Mill, who incidentally is not much talked about as far as India's intellectual colonization is concerned, but this individual has exerted a strong influence. And in order to understand his influence and discourse, it becomes extremely important that we get into his biography, and then I will connect him with the exercise or the enterprise that had been undertaken by William Jones and Asiatic Society in Kolkata. James Mill was born in 1773. His family had shoemaking business. But interestingly, his family background had a history. And the history was that his mother came from an aristocratic background. In 1748, there was an uprising in Scotland by the name of Stuart Uprising, in which James Mill's grandfather had participated. His grandfather's side lost in that uprising, because of which the aristocracy was taken away from him. James Mill's mother was familiar with this history, of course, and she wanted to regain what she had lost, or what her father had lost. And she decided to make James Mill the medium. So, when James Mill was born, she decided that she would not allow him to take the shoemaking or the shoe selling business. On the contrary, she would make him a gentleman. By that, she meant that she would make him an aristocrat. Now, interestingly, James Mill was a precocious child. He was very good in studies. And his intellectual leanings or propensities were identified very early in his career by the local aristocrats, the Stuarts, interestingly. The Lady Stuart had this understanding that she would raise him to become a preacher. And that is what his training was. And because of the aristocratic support that he had, he was not educated at the local University of Aberdeen, but at University of Edinburgh, where he completed his bachelor's and master's in divinity studies. He completed his studies in 1797, and then he looked for a permanent position to become a preacher in the vicinity, in the locality, in Scotland basically. But he was not successful. He was trying to make his living teaching the students of aristocrats, and there were a couple of humiliating experiences that he had, which made him to switch his career and move to London in 1802, which at that point in time had already become a city of opportunities. So in 1802, James Mill moves to London and begins his journalistic career by writing for newspapers and journals. For one of the periodicals that he worked for, he was also reviewing the translated materials that were coming from the Asiatic Society to Europe. And in 1806, he decided that he would write the history of British India. His agenda was very clear. What he was finding was that there was a motley of information on India, but there wasn't a collected information on India, and by then the East India Company had also started rising in power. So he thought that he would write the history of British India also to assist in the governance of India. So in a certain sense, you can say that the history of British India was a governance manual. it was meant for governance of India by the British. That was at the very root of the history of British India. Also, James Mill had thought that he would complete the book in 3-4 years and move on to other things. But there was something very significant that happened in 1808. He met the father of utilitarianism, Jeremy Bentham. And here it becomes important that we know the story of Jeremy Bentham. Jeremy Bentham had been trained as a lawyer at the University of Oxford. He tried his hand at becoming a lawyer, but he was not successful. So he decided to turn into a writer. Bentham incidentally had an aristocratic background, so money was not a problem for him. Money was a problem for James Mill, but it was not a problem for Jeremy Bentham. Though in the initial stages of his career, he did not find any support from his father. James Mill, because we are backtracking the story, Jeremy Bentham was quite aggrieved at the socio-political situation that he was finding in Britain in late 1700s. The socio-political condition in Britain at that point in time was extremely hierarchical and oppressive. And Bentham, in the vigor of his youth or his naivety, thought that he would write tomes about the situation and he would be able to alter or transform the socio-political context of the British society. And in order to do that, he revolved his writings around this central axiomatic principle called the greatest good for the greatest number, which incidentally is a direct translation of what you find in the Rig Veda, Bahujan Hitaya, Bahujan Sukhaya. The folklore is that Jeremy Bentham came across this axiom in a pamphlet. I have to do research in finding out how this idea traveled to Europe. But this central Rig Vedic principle, interestingly, became Jeremy Bentham's war cry for the transformation of the European society. So, the legitimate question to ask at this point in time is, what made the society hierarchical and oppressive? The society was hierarchical and oppressive because power was held amongst monarchy, aristocracy, and clergy. It was predominantly in the hands of the aristocrats. The aristocrats at that point in time were quite powerful and they could even overrule the monarch. And of course, they were assisted by clergy. So, monarchy, aristocracy, and clergy in cahoots with one another were ruling and they were keeping the masses under their heels, which had caused a lot of discontent and poverty within the society, and this was something which Jeremy Bentham wanted to change and transform. And this was the central position or positionality of his writings. So let me bring this story back now to James Mill. So James Mill had a meeting with Bentham in 1808, and both of them took a liking for each other. In a very short period of time, James Mill became Bentham's chief disciple. Now, there was something very interesting about Bentham. Bentham was a true scholar, and by that I mean that his writings were expansive, detailed, very well researched, but they were also stiff in the sense that they could not be followed by the masses. James Mill was a journalist, and he had the knack and the art of simplifying Bentham's ideas and taking them to the masses. He already was a journalist, so he could do that. So, James Mill started translating Bentham's ideas for the masses, and of course, he was quite creative in his own ways in representing the ideas. The writing of the history of British India continued. There was another something very significant that happened around 1814. James Mill got invited by Macquarie Napier, who was the editor of the Encyclopedia Britannica, to contribute in the supplement of the Encyclopedia Britannica for 3 consecutive volumes. So James Mill's writings for the social political context of Britain appeared in the supplement to Encyclopedia Britannica from 1815 to 1824. These writings basically form the crux of the writings that he did for Britain. And as I said earlier, he was completing the history of British India. Now, initially he had thought that he would complete the history of British India in 3-4 years, but that didn't happen. It took 12 years for James Mill to finish the history of British India. The history of British India was published in late December 1817 or early 1818, January 1818. That was when it came out. And the book sold like hotcakes. Now, this is about history of British India. You know, I will talk about things that happened later. But at this point in time, it becomes extremely significant to talk about the context, the contents of the history of British India. The history of British India is written in 3 volumes. In the first volume itself, there are 7 chapters on the Hindus. And these chapters are extremely useful for us to look into, because these chapters have determined the discourse on the Hindus and ancient India. So what was the larger framework in which James Mill wrote this work? The larger framework was to show Hindus as savage and barbaric people. He uses words like barbarianism, savagery, uncivilization, rudeness, uncouthness, and so on and so forth for the Hindus, left, right, and center. The entire work is littered with these words. So just to emphasize this point, that it was in this overarching category of uncivilization and savagery of Hindus that James Mill wrote his 7 chapters on Hindus. What did he do to characterize the savagery of Hindus? He basically made the Hindus and the world of Hindus hierarchical and oppressive since antiquity. So there's something that needs to be recognized and emphasized, which is that it is within this overarching umbrella of savagery and uncivilization of Hindus that the hierarchical and oppressive nature of Hindus were described and defined. Within this description, he describes our social system as hierarchical and oppressive. And while he is doing this, he puts the Brahmanas at the top, the Kshatriyas next to them. And after the Brahmanas and the Kshatriyas, Vaishyas, Shudras, and Chandalas. So it is a very strict, unilinear, hierarchical, societal description that we find in the writings of James Mill in the history of British India. In the subsequent chapter, he talks about the Hindu form of governance. And he makes this point that since antiquity, the ancient Hindu civilization has been hierarchical and oppressive. Whereas, or rather where the king or the monarch, in cahoots with the Brahmanas, ruled the roost. This is what his description is. Subsequently, he describes the Hindu laws, the laws that we had in our Dharma Shastras. There also it's the same story. He makes our laws hierarchical and oppressive. The taxation structure is made hierarchical and oppressive in his description. I would not go into all the details here because my appeal to all the viewers and the audience is that they should read the 7 chapters of the history of British India themselves in order to understand the nature of the discourse that James Mill created on us. Now, let me come to why understanding his discourse becomes important. Because this was a text which was written way back in 1817. Why are we talking about this text today? It is to 2024. And this is where our analysis becomes important. The history of British India brought such popularity to James Mill that James Mill was hired as an East India Company official in 1819. And by the time it was 1823, he was second in command of the hierarchy of the officials who were operating from the headquarters of the East India Company in London. By the time it was 1830, James Mill became the chief officer at India House, which was the headquarters of the East India Company in London. So in a certain sense, and this is something very significant, we do not know about it, which is that James Mill practically was the CEO of the East India Company, because above him you only had the board of directors with its president, who was a British parliamentarian. This is the hierarchy that we are talking about, and this is the political influence that James Mill came to wield on India. So the history of British India is no mean text. It is an important text, and we need to look into the numerous influences that this text had on the lives of the Indian people. So the first thing that happened was that the history of British India became the required reading at Haileybury College, where the East India Company officials were getting trained before they came to serve the company in India. So they came with a certain understanding of the Indian people, which was fairly ugly. They came tutored that the Hindu people, the Indian people, were completely savage and uncivilized. So the East India Company officials could be as oppressive as they wanted in ruling the Indian people. This was the first consequence that happened. Now, back in London, James Mill, with his fellow utilitarians, put together University of London in 1825, which was created in opposition to the Oxford and Cambridge universities. So there is another consequence to the writings of James Mill. The writings of James Mill began to get academically institutionalized. What I have come to understand is that James Mill became the paradigm determiner on all the subsequent history of India books that got written from England. When you look into the publications of the Oxford University Press and Cambridge University Press, you find the paradigm that James Mill had created reflected in the writings. So James Mill basically got the ball rolling as far as a particular discourse on India is concerned. That discourse, interestingly, has not been critically examined, because that discourse reflects itself on all the discourse that you find on India and Hinduism in the mainstream, whether it is in India or it is abroad. There is something extremely significant, to the writings of James Mill in the history of British India, which is that his writings on India and Hinduism are complete pieces of imagination. And why do I say they are complete pieces of imagination? James Mill never visited India. He never came to India. That's point number one. The second thing is that when you compare his writings on India with his socio-political writings for the British social political context, you find that the content of his writings for the history of British India was suffused with the socio-political conditions back home that James Mill was encountering. The terms, interestingly, were Indian and Hindu, but the content came from his British social political context. So let me give you an example. If James Mill was talking about Hindu Brahmins, he was essentially talking about English clergy. When James Mill was talking about an Indian monarch, he was fundamentally talking about a British monarch. If James Mill was talking about the Hindu Kshatriyas, he was essentially talking about the British aristocrats. Now, look at the irony of this situation. The socio-political description of the Hindu people and ancient India, which has become institutionalized in the current discourse, is not about India. It is actually about Britain and the British people. It is complete imagination. It is complete fabrication. An imagination which has become reality to the core for the Indian people. So now what I'm going to do is that I will talk about this book which I've written recently. It is called Colonial Discourse and the Suffering of Indian American Children. As the title suggests, you may feel that this is for the American context. Yes, it is true that the book is about the suffering of Indian American children. But the discussion of that particular topic is only in the last 2 chapters. First 4 chapters of the book are relevant for India and Hinduism studies anywhere in the world. So for the people who are listening to this lecture in India, I would say that you could leave the last 2 chapters of the book and just focus on the first 4 chapters. I will ask the Mythic Society to share the link of the book from where you will be able to download the book completely for free. Both the Kindle version as well as the PDF form. So this book is completely free, and I would have Mythic Society circulate the link from where you will be able to download the book in entirety. What I'm going to do right now is that I am going to focus on chapter 4 of the book, where I'm talking about the imagination of James Mill, which has become the reality for Indian people. reality which is not only intellectual but also political. And you will be able to see why. So, in chapter 4, there are some subheadings under which I have made my discussion. I would want you to go through them yourself. What I'm going to do is that I will just read out some of those subheadings. The Hindu Brahmins and Mills' history are English clergy. Mill's Hinduism is the mirror image of Christianity of the Church of England, which he wanted to suppress and transform. Mill's Hindu form of governance is fabricated and projected against the forms of governance he wanted to undermine and suppress in Britain. Mill defines the Hindu taxation system in the light of the British system that he wanted obliterated. So, what is it that Mill was doing? There were certain socio-political conditions which he and other utilitarians wanted to reform. And he was successful in this because in 1832, the British political system underwent a significant reform in the form of parliamentary reform. It was this parliamentary reform of 1832 which put Britain on road to representational democracy. What is it that James Mill did? James Mill ejected all the filth of his own society and funneled it into the Indian society through the discourse that he created. And that discourse has become part of our everyday reality. And as I said earlier, when he was talking about the Hindu Brahmins, he was not actually talking about the Hindu Brahmins. He was talking about English clergy. When he was talking about the British aristocrats, he was projecting that understanding onto the Hindu Kshatriyas. And I have proof for this, and this is the proof that I have produced in this chapter 4 of the book that I just spoke about. I won't have time to go through the details of all the subheadings that I read out to you, but what I will do is that I will read out to you some portions from the subheading Hindu Brahmins are, or rather, Mill's Hindu Brahmins are actually English clergy. And as I said, what is the methodology that I have followed? The methodology that I have followed is that I have put his socio-political writings for Britain next to his writings on India in the history of British India. And this is where I was able to figure out the correspondence. So, in one of the articles that he wrote for the supplement to Encyclopedia Britannica, while talking about the Church of England and English clergy, the following is what James Mill writes. And as I read this, please simultaneously think about the regular or the normal discourse on Brahmins that exists in India at this point in time. Just think about this. I am going to show the correspondence also as we move forward in this discussion. But I would also want you to keep this in mind. We think it proper to begin by distinctly stating our opinion that an ecclesiastical establishment is essentially anti-Christian, that religion can never be safe or sound unless where it is left free to every man's choice, wholly uninfluenced by the operation either of punishment or reward on the part of the magistrate. So there are two things that are already coming out in this description. One is that the practice of religion was not free in this society. It was controlled by the Church of England. James Mill called it derisively Church of Englandism. Compare it with our traditional Hindu society. The pursuit of dharma, the pursuit of ultimate has always been free. Why do I say so? Because after following the dharma of Grihastha, one was free to take sannyas and seek the ultimate. There was complete freedom in terms of following the path to the ultimate. And this is something which Swami Vivekananda also has spoken about. In his writings, Swami Vivekananda says that whereas the society of the Hindus was regimented, he uses the term religion, We may not agree with the use of term religion at this point in time for obvious reasons. But he says that religion was completely free. In contrast, religion in Western societies is regimented, whereas the society is free. What I want to point out is that this freedom of religion issue, where is it that the Western people are getting it from? Where did the utilitarians get this idea from? This was coming from how the Europeans and Britishers were observing things in our society. That is something to be noted. But let me go back to how the English clergy has been described in the writings of James Mill. We think it proper to even go further and declare that it is not religion only to which an ecclesiastical establishment is hostile. In our opinion, there is not one of the great interest of humanity on which it does not exercise a baneful influence. I'm repeating this. There is not one of the great interest of humanity on which it does not exercise a baneful influence. The clergy have a long course of usurpation, established a sort of right to call themselves and their interest by the most sacred names. In ecclesiastical language, the wealth and power of the clergy are religion. Keep thinking about how the Brahmins have been described. Be as treacherous, be as dishonest, be as unfeeling and cruel, be as profligate as you please, you may still be religious. But breathe on the interest of the clergy, make them surmise discredit at your hands, and you are the enemy of religion. Nay, the enemy of your God, and all the mischief which religious prejudice and antipathy, the poisoned, deadly weapon of the clergy, can bring down upon its victim, is the sure and necessary consequence of your sacrilegious audacity. There's one more from the same article. We desire also to be understood as disapproving of an injustice of which clergymen have often great reason to complain, that of confounding the character of individuals with the corporation to which they belong. We have very many bad corporations in which excellent men are included, and such is the case of the priestly corporation. But the question is not how many clergymen, from the influence of education and the spirit of the community to which they belong, are, in their private relation and taken individually, estimable men. You may take a number of men one by one, all virtuous and honorable, who yet, if you club them together and enable them to act in a body, will appear to have renounced every principle of virtue, and in pursuit of their own objects will trample without shame or remorse upon everything valuable to their fellow men. We proceed upon the principle that men desire power, that they desire it in as great quantity as possible, and that they do not desire it for nothing. Men do not strive for power that it may lie in their hands without using. And what is the use of it? The answer is plain. It is to make other men do what we please, to place their persons, their actions, and properties to as great an extent as possible at our disposal. This is known to be one of the strongest propensities in human nature, and altogether insatiable. The ministers of religion, and by that he means the English clergy, are not less subject to this passion than other men. They are cited proverbially as an example of its excess. These are his writings for the English context. What does he say about the Brahmins in the history of British India? The priesthood is generally found to usurp the greatest authority in the lowest state of society. Of course, he was describing the Hindu society as uncivil and uncouth. Knowledge and refined conception of the divine nature are altogether incompatible with the supposition that the deity makes favorites of a particular class of mankind and is more pleased with those who perform a ceremonial service to himself than with those who discharge with fidelity the various and difficult duties of life. It is only in rude and ignorant times that men are so overwhelmed with the power of superstition as to pay unbounded veneration and obedience to those who artfully clothe themselves with the terrors of religion. The Brahmins among the Hindus have acquired and maintained an authority more exalting, more commanding and extensive than the priests have been able to engross among any other portion of mankind. As great a distance as there is between the Brahmin and the divinity, so great a distance is there between the Brahmin and the rest of the species. The Brahmin is declared to be the lord of all the classes. He alone to a great degree engrosses the regard and favor of the deity, and it is through him and at his intercession that Blessings are bestowed upon the rest of mankind. The sacred books are exclusively his. The highest of the other classes are barely tolerated to read the word of God. He alone is worthy to expound it. The first among the duties of civil magistrates, supreme or subordinate, is to honor the Brahmins. Mysterious and artful powers are ascribed to this wonderful being. Not only is this extraordinary respect and preeminence rewarded to the Brahmins, they are allowed the most striking advantages over all the members of the social body. In almost everything with regards to the social state, their influence over the government is only bounded by their desires, since they have impressed the belief that all laws which a Hindu is bound to respect are contained in the sacred books, that it is lawful for them alone to interpret these books, and it is incumbent on the king to employ them as chief counselors and ministers, and to be governed by their advice. So, you don't even need to go into all the writings that he did for the socio-political context for Britain. Even what I have collated in this book of mine, you will see that the correspondences are extremely clear. When James Mill talks about the Hindu Brahmins, James Mill is basically and fundamentally talking about the English clergy. Now, interestingly, this discourse became the normative discourse. This is the discourse which gets reflected from different departments of Indian universities at this point in time. This is the font of that discourse. And that is why, when we look at the current discourse, the current mainstream discourse on India and Hinduism, ancient India in particular, and Hinduism, you will find that it is at variance with what is there in the Dharma Shastras and in our texts, in our sacred texts. There is a disconnect, there is a fault line. James Mill is the creator of that fault line. This fault line, interestingly, has not been sufficiently studied. And this is what my book, The Colonial Discourse and the Suffering of Indian American Children, is doing. And through this lecture, through this discussion, I am offering it to the people to go through it, to understand the contents, so that this very important project of decolonization which we have begun gets furthered. And with that, I will close. Thank you once again for giving me the opportunity to come to the Mythic Society and address you all. Thank you very much.
It was a wonderful and enlightening lecture. We thank you very much for the same. Thank you very much. And I want to thank Sri Shivkumar GV also for helping us in arranging this lecture. Sir, thank you very much.